Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on electricity planning in the West of London area. My name is Rosal Gratella, and I work in the Regional and Community Engagement Group at the Independent Electricity System Operator, IESO. Our group is responsible for managing relationships, engaging, and supporting communities across Ontario on a wide range of electricity matters, such as electricity planning, which is really the focus of our discussion today. I personally work primarily with communities in Southwest and Northeast Ontario, and it's great to see it's such a great turnout and many familiar faces, or rather names, on the webinar today. We are really pleased to hold today's engagement session to discuss two electricity planning initiatives underway in Southwest Ontario, and more specifically in the West of London area. Me on the webinar today are my colleagues Michelle Wong and Candida DaCosta from our transmission planning team, who will present the details of the slides today. And we also have Megan Lund, Manager of Transmission Planning, as well on hand to address any questions that may come up. The presentation material was posted last week, hopefully to give you a sense of what we're going to cover off and discuss today, and to help prepare questions that you may have for us as you consider any feedback that you'd like to submit after this webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the IESO's website afterwards for those unable to join us. We'll break at a few junctures to address any questions, so please feel free to use the chat function on the webinar to offer any comments or ask any questions. And we can also take questions over the phone. Again, we just also ask that you keep your lines on mute as we're going through the presentation to reduce any background noise. We have 2 hours allocated for this webinar. We may not require the full time, and also in the event that we might not get to all of the questions or comments today, we will be sure to post them and publish answers afterwards. Now, before we get into the meat of today's webinar, it's my pleasure to introduce Candice Trickey, our Director of Corporate Affairs at the IESO, for opening remarks, to give us a bigger picture context of some key electricity sector developments and initiatives, really to help inform the discussion today. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Candice.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, Rosal. You can hear me okay?
Perfect.
Perfect. That's great. Thanks for that. Yeah, I am really glad to be here. I think regional planning and the work that's happening, particularly in the Southwest, is there is a lot going on. And I think increasingly we're seeing more of a connection between what's happening in communities and regions with what's happening on the broader system across Ontario. So I thought I could talk a little bit about some of the context of that and give you a sense of some of the things that are happening at the IESO. So I think that we are seeing a big shift on our resource landscape at the moment. We've had a number of years of, what we would call surplus electricity, meaning we've had plenty of resources available to us to meet all of our electricity needs. We're seeing a shift in that. We're now getting closer to a time when we will see capacity needs emerging, meaning we will need to have more resources committed to being available to provide electricity in Ontario. This is mainly due to existing contracts with generators starting to expire, the retiring of the Pickering nuclear plants, and other nuclear refurbishments that are happening that will mean that certain units are out at different times. On top of this, we're also seeing a lot of, really unprecedented growth in the Southwest Ontario area. New expanded greenhouses contributing to electricity demand, and what we're forecasting to see is, doubling of the electricity demand over the next 5 years, which is quite a quick and large growth. But in particular, in the Kingsville-Leamington area, we're actually projecting to see triple growth by 2026. So this is why this area is so important to us, because there are a lot of changes happening and happening quickly. And planning for these types of things and for the future of electricity is really a big part of what we do with the IESO. And part of that is working with communities like Southwest Ontario, West of London area. Whether they're big or small, rural or urban communities, we need to understand what's happening in them so that we can factor that into our planning for the future. And I think part of that is also understanding what those communities want to see in their communities and how they want to address their needs. And we're definitely seeing an increase in that as well. So we do need the input of a lot of different parties to bring all these things together. We need to hear from the local distribution companies, what they're seeing, the transmitters, how they're planning for the future, municipal planners, and members of the community, stakeholders like you, to help inform the decisions that we'll need to make to ensure that we have a reliable electricity system in place at all times. So on planning, one of our key documents that we release every year is our annual planning outlook. It's set to be released in December, and it will provide more information on our capacity and energy needs. But what you will see is that there is a capacity need, a need for more resources to be committed, to be available, and that need emerges in 2022, but it can be met with resources that are in the province and that are available. But we also will start to see a need for new resources we don't currently see existing in the system by 2025, as we see many contracts reach end of term and as I said, Pickering retires. So we are quickly getting to a point in time when we will need to procure more resources. So one of the things the ISO has focused on lately is developing what we're calling a resource adequacy framework. So a set of tools or mechanisms that we'll be able to use to ensure that we can procure capacity to continue to meet Ontario's electricity system needs. So we've been talking to stakeholders about that over the course of this fall, and that's something we'll be spending a lot of time talking about or developing with stakeholders over the course of next year as well. While we get into more of the details of that framework, how we operationalize it, how we implement it. And the framework looks at ensuring that we're able to meet needs in 3 different time frames, over the short, medium, and long term. And over the short term, we do have a capacity auction that will be run annually, and that's the primary mechanism we'll use to acquire smaller amounts of capacity that we need to meet system demand. And in fact, that first capacity auction is taking place next week. And that auction will enable competition between different types of resources. You'll be able to see off-contract generators, existing storage, demand response, and system-backed imports participating in those auctions. And while that's only one tool, it is a big milestone, I think, for us, is opening that auction and seeing different types of resources participate in it. But as I said, we'll also be developing other mechanisms that provide different ways for us to procure needs that we see, that also sort of span out over the medium and long term. So again, there's more on that. If you're interested, you follow along or participate in that engagement, which is called the Resource Adequacy Framework. More on that on our website. And another thing I thought we could touch on is innovation. We are seeing a lot of, advancements. I think everybody in all walks of life are seeing technology advancements that are impacting, what's available to us in the world. But we are seeing it in the electricity system as well. And I think one of the big themes is a growing role for what we would call distributed energy resources. So smaller, generation, storage, demand response resources that are available and primarily built to address local needs or individual business needs, but that also have the potential to address provincial needs. So these, enabling these resources to participate in our market is an opportunity for us. I think one that would allow us to introduce more competition. So it's something that also the ISO will be focused on next year is how do we better enable those distributed resources to participate in our market and compete against the larger, more traditional resources. So there is an engagement that we'll be looking at next year to develop a work plan that will talk about how we will enable different types of resources and ensure that they're able to participate in our markets going forward. On that note, though, there is work underway, and over the last number of years, we've been focused on storage and did recently release a storage interim design. But there are lots of other innovative projects that we have underway. The ISO has the Grid Innovation Fund, which you may may or may not have heard of, but it was established in 2005, and it's one of the mechanisms we have for supporting projects that can help us test out and understand new opportunities for different approaches, different types of resources and approaches to meeting our resource needs. And since 2005, we've supported over 200 different energy projects. This year has been an interesting one for the fund. Despite the pandemic, or maybe because of it, it's hard to know. We've actually received almost double the number of applicants this year compared to last year for our intake window. Something that indicates obviously to us that there is more interest in innovative companies moving into the electricity space, something that we look to support through that fund. And I do think these innovative approaches and technologies are something that are getting a lot of attention in communities like the Southwest. And I think that there's a few examples that I thought I could walk through today. One is virtually here in the Windsor-Essex area, and another in the York Region area. In the York Region, we've recently launched the province's first local electricity market. And the intent of that is to better understand how we can take those small distributed energy resources I talked about and allow them to compete against traditional wires-based infrastructure. So it looks at procuring through an auction small resources in a local area, but ones that can be used both locally and more broadly on the wholesale grid. And actually, we just published the results of that auction yesterday, so you can look on our website if you're interested in that. And really, one of the key goals behind that is helping us to understand how we can what we call interoperate those types of resources that are traditionally focused on meeting local needs, but as I said, have the potential to meet global or province-wide needs. But that means that we have to figure out how to make sure we're not calling on those resources to do both things at the same time. So how do we work with the local distribution company to enable the resource to meet both sets of needs as it can? So it's a project I think we're looking forward to seeing how it progresses. In the Southwest, as I mentioned, we've also been looking at other innovative ways to try to meet system needs. So what we've been doing in that area is targeting local solutions through energy efficiency projects in the Grid Innovation Fund, as well as targeted conservation programs for the greenhouse sector. So we've been really focusing on those as a means to ensure that we allow the infrastructure we have in that area to last or go as far as it can, last as long as it can because of the growing needs in that area. So looking at reducing the electricity needs in the greenhouse sector so that, again, we can allow them to continue to grow while we develop the infrastructure needed for future growth. And I would also mention that we do have a new conservation framework that will be starting to roll out next year, and that will have a focus both on meeting provincial needs as well as local needs. So there will be a continued focus on how energy efficiency can help meet those local needs and, again, help make those the infrastructure in those areas go further and last longer. We know that, conservation, one of the reasons we focus on that is that the conservation is a very cost-effective resource when areas like that. And so it's an important way that we can develop those communities. So I think, a big part of the regional planning process is understanding the needs of your community. So I've talked about different ways, different projects that we have that we can we use to help address the needs, but really what we're here to do is to try to better understand what your needs are. So I think, part of the goal is helping you understand what we see on the horizon, what the needs are in the area, and then the rest of the goal is understanding how you see those needs, what other things you have coming forward, whether it's through the local distribution companies, through municipal planning, or through other needs or priorities for those communities. So this, I think, really today is about, again, us helping you understand the bigger picture of what we see from the electricity sector, and then hopefully hearing from you as well to better understand the needs in your area and what's important to you. So really glad to see such a great turnout and interest in this. I suspect your questions will be largely for the speakers to come, those that are experts in the planning that's happening in your area. But before I hand back to Roselle, I am happy to take any questions that you might have about some of the topics that I went over this morning. So I'll send back to you, Roselle, and see if there are any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Candice. So just a reminder, if you have any questions for Candice at this time, feel free to use the chat function. Alternatively, you can also unmute your line. So perhaps we'll just take a moment here to see if there are any questions. Okay, so there doesn't appear to be any questions at this time. I'm sure other questions will come up as we go through today's presentation. So I'd really like to once again thank you to Candice for taking the time this morning to provide opening remarks to really set up our discussion for later throughout this presentation.
Thanks, Roselle.
Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and dive right into today's presentation. So here is our agenda for today. We'll just spend a bit of time to go over the objectives and where we're really interested in receiving your input. The first part of the webinar will cover the Windsor-Essex Integrated Regional Resource Plan Addendum Study that Michelle Wong will take everyone through. And the second part will discuss the West of London bulk study that Candida Da Costa will cover. And today's webinar is really a bit unique in the sense that we are covering two distinct electricity planning initiatives. We're having one webinar today given the overlap in the scope of these two studies and really some of the broader implications on Southwest Ontario, and also keeping in mind many community stakeholders and interested parties that we've convened here today would likely participate in both discussions. So we're really excited to have this meeting with you all today. Our objectives for today's webinar is really, as we mentioned, to discuss these two electricity planning initiatives that are underway in the areas west of London, and to seek input on the defined needs and potential options that are being examined. So here we have posed a few specific questions that we are asking for your input on. We ask that you keep these questions in mind as we go through the slides today, and also remember that you don't have to give us your feedback today. As shown here, we're going to be collecting written input via email up until December 17th. The main focus of today's webinar and where we're seeking input on is really around the options that we're examining to address the electricity needs in the areas west of London that have been defined through these two studies that you'll hear more about soon. Input from communities, stakeholders, and other interested parties really is an important consideration for us, and we're really interested in hearing your feedback on what information needs to be taken into account as these options are assessed. My colleagues Michelle and Candida will discuss both electricity planning initiatives in greater detail soon, but before we get into that, we wanted to quickly touch on where each one fits in the broader context of electricity planning in Ontario. So on the far left here, bulk system planning typically focuses on the electricity resources that take the energy from the generation source to local distribution companies across the province. Our bulk system also addresses provincial electricity needs and broader policy direction, such as assessing the impact of activities such as refurbishment of nuclear facilities or energy policies on the electricity system. In the middle portion here, it's regional planning, which looks at each region's unique needs and considers generation, transmission, and distribution, and innovative resources to meet those needs in a much more local context. Regional system planning ensures a reliable supply of electricity to Ontario's 21 electricity planning regions. And finally, on the far right here, at the other end of the spectrum, local distribution companies carry out distribution network planning to address local electricity needs and priorities at the community level, such as building distribution infrastructure to connect a new subdivision or delivering connections that are much more local in nature. So we really just wanted to set this out to provide the context for the part 1 and part 2 discussions that we'll be having. So with that, we'll kick off part 1 of today's webinar, and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Michelle Wong, to discuss the Windsor-Essex Addendum Study. So I'm just going to pass that over. Michelle, you should have control.
Okay, yes, I see it. All right, hi everyone. Thanks, Rosal, for that introduction. As Rosal mentioned, I'll spend the first half of this webinar focused on this addendum study, and then the latter half will be led by Candida to discuss the West of London bulk study. So Rosal started the introduction to regional planning, but I'll also touch upon or give an overview. I think there are a lot of familiar names on the webinar today, so I think many of you have some experience with regional planning, but even so, I think some background is also useful. Regional planning occurs in Ontario for 21 different planning regions, and these regions have been formalized several years ago, not based on municipal boundaries, but rather electrical boundaries. And we have this established formal process for regional planning. Of course, the different needs of each community will be unique, but there are some core activities that occur throughout the process for each region. Some of these activities include developing this electricity demand forecast. So essentially, we look at the region and we estimate how much electricity the region might need over the next 10 years or next 20 years. We also work with the community to identify needs, particularly the type of need, also the timing and the magnitude of it. There's also always if there are needs, there's a solution development phase where we work with the transmitter, the local distribution companies, and also gather input from other stakeholders to develop potential options to meet those needs. And in the end, we would recommend the preferred or best option to meet the needs that have been identified. So for regional planning in Windsor-Essex, I think there's a lot going on in Windsor-Essex. It's been a very busy region for the past couple of years. And as you all know, it's largely because a lot of load growth is being forecast, especially in the Kingsville-Leamington area, due to all the greenhouse expansions. So last year in September, we published this Integrated Regional Resource Plan, or an IRP, for the entire Windsor-Essex region. And that was also followed by a regional infrastructure plan led by the transmitter Hydro One, published several months later. So through the IRP, there were a number of different recommendations, and a lot of those were meant to address the supply needs in the Kingsville-Leamington area. This includes the switching station that has been recommended located in Lakeshore, as well as the new 230 kilovolt circuits that will be in place between Chatham and Lakeshore. But another recommendation that came out of the IRP is this addendum study, because we recognize that there are some remaining needs outstanding, especially in the local system in Kingsville-Leamington. And I think that's also a testament to just how large those supply capacity needs are. And so I'll walk through the scope of this addendum study, the needs that we need to address, as well as the options we're currently evaluating to meet them. Before I go into the specific needs for the addendum study, though, I think it's always useful to have an idea of the types of needs we typically encounter in regional planning. So one common need that we might identify is a capacity need. Capacity essentially refers to how much load we can actually reliably supply. A capacity need can either occur at the station level, in which case it's just the station capacity need, or it could be a little bit broader and refer to a certain area or a certain subset of the system, which would be a system capacity need. And often you'll hear us use this term of load meeting capability. So if there is a capacity need, it means we are unable to supply the forecast load within the planning criteria that we must meet. Load restoration and supply security needs are a little different. They revolve around how much load can be restored in the event of an outage or a contingency, and also they concern how much load is interrupted in the first place. So we have certain criteria that we must plan the system to, so that, for example, if an extreme weather event happens and there's an outage on a part of the system, we must assess how much load is lost and how that load might be restored and in how much time. End-of-life asset replacement needs, I think they're true to their name. We essentially have infrastructure across the province that are of different ages, and once they reach end of life, that information goes into regional planning so that we can work with the working group and the stakeholders to make the best decision once they are end of life. So sometimes that facility could be replaced simply with a newer identical facility, or sometimes the region has changed so that a different option would be better. Perhaps that facility is upgraded, or perhaps the region has changed so much that we would retire that facility and put other infrastructure in place. So those are the general categories of needs. For the Windsor-Essex IRP addendum study, as I mentioned before, a lot of the needs were identified and studied as part of the IRP, and a good portion of that was a large capacity need due to the strong load growth in Kingsville and Leamington. So after the switching station is in place, located at Lakeshore, that intersection in the upper right-hand corner of the diagram, and after the circuits are in place and there are new load supply stations also in development at Lakeshore, there does still remain a capacity need. And a lot of these remaining capacity needs are located closer to the existing Kingsville station, farther south. So that is one need that the addendum study is looking to address, adding additional capacity to that area. It's also another note to make is that this existing Kingsville station is already at its capacity, or it's fully loaded. The other major need scoped into this addendum study concerns not capacity, but load restoration and security. So essentially on this Leamington tap, or the part of the system you see in the dashed oval, we have upwards of 500 megawatts on that portion of the system. We have quite a bit of load at that Leamington Transformer Station, or TS, that has recently also been expanded. And we have a number of directly connected transmission customers on that tap, on those circuits that connect Leamington to Lakeshore Switching Station, or that intersection. So once these new customers connect, once the station is fully loaded, there does arise a load restoration and security need. So an example I can give is, in the case of a contingency on those circuits you see there supplying Leamington, we are violating some criteria in terms of how much load would be lost in such an event, and we are quite limited right now, based on this existing configuration, in terms of how quickly we could restore that load. And so the addendum study is exploring options to help improve that situation. And then more broadly speaking, there are a number of supply capacity issues that are closer to, I would say, the city of Windsor, or the Windsor area, namely supply to the 115 kV network there. And these are issues that we've known about, and they are currently and historically have been managed by operational measures. So, for example, special protection schemes that allow our control room to take certain actions to help mitigate any problems or issues. And so as the addendum study proceeds, as the loads connect and there are changes on the bulk system, we do want to keep in mind that there may be modifications that are then required of these protection schemes or new requirements. And so the addendum study, as we are comparing our options, will have to take that into consideration as well. So those are the core needs that have been scoped into the study. I will get into some of the options that we are exploring. As many of you may know, through regional planning, we ultimately want to work with the distributors, the transmitter, and of course the communities and stakeholders to recommend a solution that is, one, the most cost-effective, and of course technically feasible, and then I guess bonus points for being a well-integrated solution. And I'll speak more to some of these considerations later on. But some of the options that we may examine include non-wires alternatives. So these would be your distributed energy resources, your energy efficiency measures, and so on. Then you have your wires options, which are kind of more traditional transmission infrastructure, like your step-down station or your new transmission line or circuit. And then we would also look at generation, which might be a new gas plant or even a utility-scale storage facility. So I'll start off with speaking more on the wires option for the addendum study before moving on to kind of the non-wires component. Right now, we are still finalizing our technical studies, and we expect to be able to share results early next year in Q1. But generally, for the addendum study, the wires options involve a number of different key elements, one of which is a reconfiguration option. Reconfiguration meaning we're looking at the existing 115 kV infrastructure that's already in the area and assessing whether we should reconfigure this lower voltage 115 kV facility to the higher voltage 230 kV network. So that's one key element. Another thing that we're assessing is whether or not we need additional load supply stations in the area and or upgrading existing load supply stations. And then what comes with that kind of naturally is we're assessing the different supply points that would optimize these new facilities and, if required, the new connection lines. When we are, as we are finalizing these technical studies, there are a lot of considerations we're trying to work through. One key consideration is technical feasibility. So can this option actually be executed? So we're working with the distributors and the transmitters to understand, where are these customers that need a connection point? What is their proximity to these different wires options? What are the routing and spacing considerations? And how might the system be operated later on? We, of course, are also prioritizing the ability to actually address the needs we've identified. So the needs for the addendum study they're a little bit tricky because we have different types of needs and a number of them. And so we'll seek to choose an option that can, or a number of options that can adequately address them. We also think about, of course, the cost effectiveness of these different options and how they're integrated. So if there's this opportunity to solve multiple needs simultaneously, I think that innately improves the cost effectiveness of a certain option. Another, perspective or way of looking at integration is the option type. So perhaps there's an opportunity here to combine multiple option types to fully satisfy the needs. We also have to consider lead time. I think for wires options, as many of you know, transmission infrastructure just takes a long time. So before they are in service, we're looking at maybe 4 to 5 years at least. And so we have to give careful consideration to how this lead time compares to the timing of our needs. And because there's so much going on in Windsor-Essex or West of London in general, we also have to carefully coordinate these staged solutions with all the other solutions that are already in development. So timing is quite important here. And I think over the next several years, as we actually witness the load materializing, keeping a close eye on how the region evolves becomes crucial. So in terms of non-wires options, I think the addendum study is pretty, it's benefiting off of a lot of work that was done through the 2019 Windsor-Essex IRP. And we're also incorporating a lot of learnings that came through with the local advisory committee that was established for the Kingsville-Leamington area. So, for example, that local advisory committee was set up with a number of different growers and experts from the area to just learn more about the load characteristics, to learn more about the industry and the possible feasibility of different non-wires options. And I think we're trying to leverage a lot of those learnings and expand upon them now. So I guess the complexity of a non-wires option is that depending on the technology type, there are different ways or strengths to each one, and they can contribute to an integrated solution in different ways. So, for example, energy storage might be a technology type that has great potential to address some of the load restoration and security needs. Demand response is an interesting option here, especially because the bulk of the load here is from lights in the greenhouses. And so demand response might materialize as lighting load curtailment. And it's also something that can be paired with energy storage or local generation or even other innovative measures. I think there's a lot of talk about smart lighting control strategies. So that may play a role with lighting response or demand response. Energy efficiency is also a non-wires option we've discussed before for this region. I think it's a non-wires option that really complements the wires infrastructure we've recommended. And I think in the long term, it'll be interesting to see how well energy efficiency supports the forecast, especially as the agriculture industry evolves and perhaps we see an increased adoption of LED lighting. I guess the complexity of evaluating non-wires options is that in addition to all the considerations I described a couple of slides ago for the wires options, I think developing these non-wires options will require more information and even more analysis. So an example of that to the right here is need characterization. We've heard a lot from stakeholders, not just in Windsor-Essex actually, but across the province, I think, that in order to evaluate and develop a non-wires option, there's more information that's required on, for example, the load behavior. So having these extra details on how the load changes on an hourly basis or on a seasonal basis is important because this information helps us better understand the need, how frequently can we actually expect a need event or how large that need event is or how long it lasts. This is important information to help size and characterize a non-wires option. Now, on that note, there's also more information that needs to be understood regarding the economic assumptions and the financial models. So in order before we make a decision on a non-wires options, we of course want to select one that is cost effective, and we would have to compare it to the best wires options or the wires option that we think is preferred. So having good information on, the cost factors for this non-wires technology type, like its capital costs, its operating life expectations, it becomes critical. And another layer of complexity to that is also understanding, non-wires options may provide multiple services and benefits that are actually outside the scope of the addendum study. So having an understanding of future expected funding streams or other benefits of this technology type would help inform this comprehensive evaluation. So I think there's a really good opportunity for us to hear feedback either today or through the written comment period. I think we'd like to hear from stakeholders and solution providers, what information do you think we need to still incorporate in our assessment? And on the flip side of that, what information do you think or would be beneficial for the IESO to share? That sort of feedback would really help us kind of scope our non-wires options and then decide on the best path forward. And before I kind of pause for questions, there's also an update on some of the ongoing non-wires initiatives, specifically to this area. So some of you may know that there's this LED incentive for greenhouses that has been issued and targeted to the Windsor, Essex, and Chatham-Kent regions. I've been informed that this program has committed 60 gigawatt hours of energy savings and 5 megawatts of demand savings to date, and I believe the team is still working through more project applications on the way. In terms of the indoor agricultural call for proposals that was triggered after the IRP, so this call, just a reminder, is funded through the IESO's Grid Innovation Fund, and so far 2 projects have been chosen. One is led by Allegro Acres, and they are evaluating the performance of LEDs and lighting controls to reduce their electricity use. The other project chosen is led by Great Lakes Greenhouses, and they are looking to develop an AI program to increase their energy efficiency without reducing crop yields. So a lot going on in this region, both on the wires front and the non-wires front. So I will pause here. I think I see some activity in the chat anyway. But again, just to reiterate, we're looking for more feedback on the options that we've proposed so far, and we'd like to know more about the information you think we need to incorporate in our assessments before we make a recommendation.
Great, thanks so much, Michelle. So we do see that we have a few questions here on the material that Michelle just covered. So just a reminder, for any questions or comments, please feel free to chat them to us in the chat window, or alternatively, if you prefer to offer the question over the line, you could use the raise hand function and unmute yourselves as an alternative as well. So I do see that Travis Lusney has raised his hand. So at this time, I'd ask Travis, you can go ahead and unmute your line and ask your question.
Thank you. Am I coming in clear?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. That was a great overview. So I have a few comments and questions. On slide 17, you talk about example of more analysis needed, such as hourly or seasonal details of the load forecast along with supply need. When can we expect that information to be published? And can I recommend that information is in an analytical form, either CSV or Excel formats?
Thanks, Travis. Yeah, so I don't think that information is available right now in that form you've specified in Excel. A lot of the information we have out there already would be found in, I think, the documents for the local advisory committee and also the IRP, where we at least described the load profile for the greenhouses, and I believe we've shared, we term them heat maps, but basically they take an hourly load forecast and compare it to transmission limit. So that information is available, and I can kind of follow up with you afterwards to direct you to it. I'm not sure if we do plan on sharing that information through a CSV file.
Okay, I think it's important because on slide 15, both the wires option and you tie back on the non-wires, to assess the technical feasibility and the ability to address needs, a non-wires alternative, whether it's generation, distributed resources, or demand response, needs to analytically be able to confirm for themselves that they're able to meet the need. And to do that, you really need to have analytics that you can present to the ISO. So I strongly recommend that information be published as soon as possible. The other part on slide 17 is the request, or at least discussion on economic assumptions and financial models for non-wires alternatives. I think there's a real missing link between the ISO's regional planning process and the reality of non-wires alternative events. When you look at a wires option, this is development under a regulated framework of which there is cost recovery for those development activities and work within the technical planning group. For non-wires alternatives, there is no process or funding there. And to release those funds within those private industries or load customers, you need to have a development opportunity, a clear path to getting at least some sort of funding for developing the project. And it also is needed for non-wires alternative developers or interested parties to get solidified pricing. If not, you're kind of getting academic analysis, which is delayed and late. If you want real deliverable projects, there really needs to be some sort of path forward, whether it's an RFQ to qualify and determine what is out there, or even an RFP, which can be a price discovery event for the ISO. And an RFP does not mean the ISO has to execute on the contract, but you're going to get real prices and real kind of economic analysis to do an adequate comparison of wires versus non-wires. So I really strongly feel that this is something the ISO, if you are going down this path and talking about non-wires or generation alternatives in the west of London or Windsor-Essex area, needs to include some sort of formal procurement mechanism to kind of go forward. And I think this links back to what we've seen in the York region that Candice was talking about at the start of this call.
I think those are some excellent points, Travis, and I'll just speak to your first point around data availability first. I think that's definitely something we can take a closer look at, and we've had some initial discussions internally already. To your point, the data's out there already, but it's not in a very usable format. So I think that's something that we definitely need to look to address. And you raised some excellent points about the RFQ and RFP and how those may fit a regional planning process. That's definitely something for us to think on as well. I'd just like to note, like, our work today on the costing side of things has really been looking at what are the system costs that we would be avoiding to kind of create that ceiling for if we did go after things, what ballpark are we looking at trying to get things in the area from a cost perspective, but we kind of need to take it a step further if we do think certain technologies might be able to meet the needs we're seeing in terms of really figuring out what the costs of those solutions would be.
Great. Thanks, Megan. I think when you look at New York or ISO New England, they take parallel paths where there's a regulated backstop solution that's developed by the utility in the area, while at the same time having a call for alternative viable solutions that you can really look at. And it ensures that the ISO doesn't get in a position where you're rushing to build a wire solution because non-wires didn't come back. So something to look at. The last comment I'll have is, and this is another kind of regional and bulk planning issue, is a lot of the development of solutions and needs analysis is done through the technical working group. And you've seen in a number of feedbacks for different ones, comments that those technical working groups do not include any non-wires alternative expertise or generation expertise. It's utilities and transmitters in the ISO, of which and this is meant as no disrespect, is really, limited kind of operational or ownership experience with non-wires. So I would recommend that either non-wires representation is included in the technical working group, or a parallel non-wires technical working group is set up with the ISO and interested parties. This would be different than the local advisory committee that's more about engagement with local communities and more with expertise and interested parties to really be able to get an understanding. And I think the key benefit is that group can also then execute potentially confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements that are needed to share more confidential information. So I would strongly recommend the ISO really look at this, especially if they are going down the path and looking at non-wires alternatives or generation options in this region up to, and I think the presentation last week was potentially to 650 megawatts.
Yeah, I think that's some great feedback and potentially something for us to look at as we look to implement some of the recommendations we have coming out of the regional planning process review about better strengthening our processes for evaluating and also determining what feasible non-wires options may be. So maybe a group like that would have a role in what that future process may look like. So thanks for that feedback.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Travis. So a few questions here received in the chat. The first one is from Dave Froezy. Would this mean that demand response would continue in winter season? As I understand, this is the last winter season for DR.
Sorry, Rochelle, can you repeat that question?
Sure. The question is, would this mean that demand response would continue in the winter season? As I understand, this is the last winter season for DR.
So the whole scope of which we've been looking at DR for the Kingsville-Leamington area has been scoped as a very local discussion. And at this point, we haven't looked at what the implementation of a DR for this area would look like. We had a lot of great discussions in the local advisory committee with a lot of community members, particularly greenhouse owners, around the practicalities of implementing DR in their greenhouses. And I think there's some work that we need to do to better understand the impact of decreasing lit hours as part of a DR program would have on crop yields. And that's one of the reasons we went forward with the targeted call to the Grid Innovation Fund, was to provide some incentive for us to garner those learnings so that if we did want to move forward with a DR program in the future, we would have a better understanding of what those impacts are and whether that's really a feasible option for growers in terms of the trade-off between costs and the impacts on their yields. So to your point, this at this point doesn't have really any bearing on whether at a provincial level we would see a need for DR in the wintertime. Our focus here has mostly been on a local conversation, but as we start to get a bit more insights into whether DR is a suitable option, there'll obviously be conversations about how we would actually implement such a program and how that fits in with how DR works at the provincial level.
Great. Thanks, Megan. The next question here is from Margaret Coombs. When is the ISO forecasting the need in the Kingsville-Leamington area and for the solution, whether wires, non-wires, or generation to be in service?
So maybe I can take that question. The timing of the need in Kingsville and Leamington, it depends on which type of need you're referring to. In terms of capacity, I think many in the area would say now, the need is now because there are customers waiting to connect. And the infrastructure isn't in place yet for that. In terms of the load restoration and security need, mostly on the Leamington tap, the timing of that would be when the loads on that Leamington tap are in service, so within the next 5 years. The solution timing, it depends on the solution type. So wires infrastructure has a lead time of at least 4 years. Longer if it's a station. Longer if it's a new circuit, for example, as opposed to a new station. And then on the non-wires, it would depend on the technology. It may be shorter with coal-fired solutions. Generation, I think, again, it depends on the generation type. I believe the lead time, for example, a gas plant would be maybe 3 years at least.
Thanks, Michelle. So I see here Chris Codd has raised his hand. So Chris, if you'd like to unmute your line and ask your question, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for providing information. It's always helpful to get an update on the plans in the area. First, I'd like to support Travis's comments around data. I know I've been asking for data in this area for quite some time and haven't been able to get anything in a format that would make analysis easy. So I just want to echo his comments on that. I have two questions. The first is I'd like to understand a bit about why you've split off generation from other non-wires alternatives. I really feel that they are sort of in the same boat, and that is more or less confirmed by the various system impact assessments in the area that show the amount of load curtailment that would be needed would be greatly reduced depending on how, for example, Brighton Beach operates. So if you could just provide some color about why that's a separate bucket from DR, behind the fence generation, and other innovative programs.
So it's a great point, and I would say like those buckets in some ways are a bit artificial and come just from in the industry how we've been approaching these problems. So from a traditional lens, we would have viewed this from the perspective of transmission versus centralized generation resources, and then over time we've been adding in this conversation around non-wires alternatives. So we've always been talking about non-wires alternatives as an addition to. But to your point, like if we were at any point to kind of say there is a need and we wanted to structure any type of RFP or other type of procurement around that need, we should be agnostic to the technologies that supply that need. I mean, there are some factors in terms of where exactly the need is located that might make a utility scale solution versus a distributed scale solution more suited to meeting those needs. But for a large number of them, it's a matter of effectively netting out load behind an interface, and whether you're doing that connected to the transmission system or connected to the distribution system, it overall has the same impact. But there's obviously some considerations to the behavior of not the behavior of those resources, but our visibility to those resources. And I think there's more comfort right now to a certain extent with the visibility and control of those utility scale resources. And so does that impact how you would go about procuring those types of resources, and does that create a barrier to approaching at being agnostic to where exactly a resource is connected? Those are all kind of questions we would still need to sort out a bit. I'm not sure if that.
No, that does answer the question. I think that's helpful confirmation, just to understand we could compete directly with these other options to the extent non-wires alternatives can meet it. Just at a high level, I would say some of the information that would be valuable would be an understanding of what the limits are, thermal versus voltage, and is it important to be on 230 for voltage, or could you be on the 115 in that Kingsville, Windsor area? Things like that would be helpful for anyone looking at any NWA solution. And to your point, like, are you pushing back on the interface? The other question I had, I just wanted to confirm, I know Hydro One has sought an exemption to ORTAC relating to the load restoration requirements on a temporary basis. Has it been ruled out that there will be no exemption on a permanent basis to reduce or defer costs associated with the transmission expansion?
At this point, we're still working under the assumption that that's a temporary exemption. So as part of this Windsor Essex IRP work, we're obviously investigating the options to meet the load restoration needs in addition to the security and capacity needs that we're seeing. But like we see in some other regions, sometimes the solutions to meet even just like a section of that criteria, maybe you can get you can resolve like 200 megawatts of that needs, but the last 50 is going to cost that much more to resolve from a restoration or a security problem. Then it becomes a discussion with the LDCs who supplied those loads and whether those costs are worth bearing for the additional system benefit in those cases, and better understanding the risk of being put in those situations and what the recourse is. So our assumption right now is it's still a temporary exemption, but once we get a final picture of the cost and feasibility of these different options, that conversation could always evolve, as we've seen in some other areas across the province.
No, that's helpful as well. So, and I just ask any additional information around how much of an exemption would be acceptable on a permanent basis would help folks looking at MWAs or a combination of MWAs and wires to understand how they could slot in from an economic perspective. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Megan. So I see Huda Oda has also raised their hand. So at this time, I'll ask you to unmute your line and go ahead and ask your question. So it does appear your line is unmuted. I am unable to hear you. There might be some technical difficulty there. So Huda is going to type the question in the chat. In the meantime, I see Peter Quiring has raised his hand. So at this time, Peter, I'd ask you to go ahead and unmute your line.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, super. So for the non-wire solution and for the generation, one of the things that wasn't possible in the past was to do behind the meter generation and then also still enter into a contract with the province. We need the power for lights between earliest would be middle of September, but really it's, I think, beginning of October. And then by April 15th, for sure, the lights are off. So we have that whole summer stretch. And with some of the resources coming offline, I think the province is going to find itself in need of summer power at least. Will it be possible to do behind the meter generation and enter into a contract with the province, or would this be one contract with the province to generate and a different contract to take power? You understand? Did I say that well?
Yeah, I don't think I can 100% answer your question today, and I think to a large extent it would depend on exactly the type of contract. So as part of this work, if we were to look to procure some type of local solution here, that would probably be a process into of itself, and so there may be some flexibility there in terms of what types of resources can compete to try to capture those types of resources. But that might vary based on like the different procurements we see across the province. So I don't think there's a clear answer there, but I think it's good to understand that that's a concern for growers in the area, is wanting to be able to access these types of programs or procurements with behind the meter resources, and making sure that as we approach this, we have an awareness of that fact, and that we might be ruling out some resources if we were not allowed to, if we didn't allow arrangements such as those.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I could add just a little bit more, almost certainly we can, the generator would be able to offer a better price to the province if we already have some of the infrastructure that we would build, if that was being paid for already by a decent sized generation behind the meter, then obviously you could offer a much better price to the province. So I think there is benefit to doing it that way. You just have to be pretty clear about when the cutoff is and who takes priority. And I can tell you for sure, from a nature fresh perspective, the province would take priority. So if the province said, hey, it's December 21st, shortest day of the year, but we need 2 or 3 hours of power today, then that's fine. We would turn the power. The province would always take priority. The other thing that I think is it should be maybe part of this. I would like to see part of this is renewables. So, example, solar combined with storage possibly, but also biomass generation. I think there's a case to be made for a combination of different types of non-wire solutions. So possibly some storage, but for sure, there's an awful lot of roof area for solar. Most of it has already been engineered in the past in anticipation of possibly putting solar on these rooftops, which is when the province is going to need the power the most. And the price of the solar has come down considerably in the last years anyway to help with that. But then I think as close to a net zero CO2 emission plant should take priority over somebody who's simply blowing away the heat and the CO2. I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Peter. Those are some great pieces of feedback, and we'll definitely consider them if we are developing any type of non-wires options for this area.
Thanks for that. So Huda's typed a few questions here in the chat. The first one is, can you please elaborate on the local generation option, who will be owning, operating, etc., and why this cannot be a low carbon generation option as opposed to gas powered? And the second part of that question is, do the energy conservation plans of municipalities in the area have any significance in this capacity analysis of the needs?
Sure. So our assessment to date doesn't really pertain to who would be owning or operating these facilities. Typically, the first cut of things we do, and really this almost feeds more into the next discussion where we've already done a bit of this today, is we'll look at the cost of a transmission alternative, and then typically the cost of a transmission connected gas facility, if that is a technically feasible way to meet the needs that we're seeing. And the reason we use that as a benchmark is that based on recent experience, that continues to be the most cost-effective generation option. So we know that costs are continuing to change quite rapidly in this space, and we are starting to look in a bit more depth at utility scale storage as a benchmark in our general assessments of transmission versus generation. But that is why we have been using this local generation gas option in the past as a benchmark. So not to say that we would necessarily go out and procure a gas solution, but we're using that essentially as a cost comparison of what the cost of a generation option would be versus transmission. And if we were to see that under that cost scenario, generation wins out, you would go out and you'd be looking for any resource to compete, but you kind of use that benchmark to determine that generation is your most cost-effective option in that case. So that's what we've done in the past. So in no ways are we dictating that needs to be a gas solution. In terms of energy conservation plans of municipalities, Michelle can maybe elaborate on this a bit more if there's anything. I know we're aware of the community energy plan that Windsor has, and taking that into account in our plans and working with the LDCs to ensure that we have the most up-to-date load forecast information. I don't know, Michelle, if there's any other community energy plans that we have awareness of in the regional plan.
Yeah, to date, I'm not aware of any additional ones. I think the overall Essex County might be undergoing a new community energy plan right now, but I'll have to. The Windsor area CEP completed a few years ago.
Good, Monica. How are you doing today?
So Claire has confirmed that the Essex County has or is working on an energy plan. So perhaps we can get more information on that after this webinar and then see how it might impact the addendum study.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. So just I think in the interest of time, we definitely are really pleased with this level of discussion and feedback so far. But I do think this is a good time to move on to the second part of today's webinar. And we'll certainly endeavor to get to all of the questions that we can, but we really appreciate everyone taking the time to provide their feedback today. And as a reminder, we will have a 3-week written comment period. So I guess before we move on to the second part, Michelle, did you want to quickly go through next steps?
Yeah, sure. So as Rosella stated, we have that written comment period. That's for 3 weeks, I think. And then in the new year, we will post that feedback if we have permission and then also respond to it. And then in Q1 of next year, we will have more engagement sessions as required, and we will share some of those results with the technical studies for the addendum. Perfect.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to pass the presentation over to my colleague, Candida DaCosta, to take us through our second part on the West of London bulk study. Candida, please go ahead.
Thanks, Rosella. Okay. So in this section, I'll just touch on some of the ongoing work that's being done to formalize the bulk planning process in general, and I will focus on the details of the West of London study for the most part. Have control. So the ISO is currently developing an integrated bulk system planning process. So for those of you who have had the pleasure of being actively involved in our various other planning initiatives, may know that we follow a relatively structured regional planning process in order to ensure that the electricity system within each of the 21 regions across Ontario can support the forecasted electricity growth at the regional level. So this assessment also occurs at a more macro level through these bulk studies to ensure that there is sufficient transfer capability into a region. However, this currently occurs on more of an ad hoc basis when there is a bulk need that is identified through the course of other studies. So in an effort to ensure that there is more transparency, predictability, and opportunities for stakeholder input, the ISO is currently undertaking a project of formalizing this bulk planning process. So at a high level, this will include providing structure as to the various stages required in bulk planning, including what steps need to be taken and when, guidance on how this process will interact with other ISO-led activities, such as resource acquisition and the regional planning processes. And importantly, it will provide some structure on how stakeholders can participate in the bulk planning process and forms of communication that, at a minimum, should be expected. So while this process is still being developed, we wanted to take the opportunity to demonstrate some of those how some of those principles may be applied to the bulk planning process by publicly engaging on the West of London bulk study that is currently underway. So some of you may be aware of the ongoing work occurring in the West of London area, since we are in the process of conducting some of those targeted stakeholder engagement with key stakeholders. But we wanted to take this opportunity to leverage the ongoing engagement in this region in order to ensure that that information is available to a broader audience. So for a bit of background, the Windsor Essex bulk study that was completed last year recommended reinforcements to address the bulk transfer requirements on the West of Chatham system. So ensuring that the system from Chatham westwards was capable of supplying the forecasted load growth, among other benefits. So from the map on the right, you'll see that our bulk study last year focused on the system west of Chatham, and the resulting recommendation was for a transmission line reinforcement from the Chatham station to the new Lakeshore station that Michelle mentioned, which is just north of Leamington. So at that time, we did note that the full capability of that west of Chatham recommendation would be limited by constraints on the system east of Chatham. And this has become even more evident through the ongoing connection assessment for the next block of load, which is at South Meadow Road TS, which would be an additional 400 megawatts supplied through that new Lakeshore switching station. So through the course of that connection assessment, what we're seeing is that as the load starts to ramp up, these east of Chatham constraints start to become more of an issue. And we are seeing that load is growing at a slightly faster rate over the near term. So there is an increased urgency to conduct this West of London study to firm up what facilities might be needed to address these east of Chatham issues. So on this slide, you will see an updated greenhouse load forecast for the West of London area. So this is similar to the forecast that was developed during the Windsor-Essex bulk study, but it has been updated based on input that we received from the local distribution companies in the area regarding changes to that load connection queue in Kingsville, Leamington, further load growth that is expected in the Dresden area, which is just slightly northeast of Chatham, and updates received from large industrial customers looking to connect in the area. So the reference forecast that you see here amounts to about a 300 megawatt increase from the previous forecast that was published, or a 1,100 megawatt of additional growth anticipated between 2023 and 2035, on top of the 400 megawatts of load that is currently looking to connect at South Meadow Road. So overall, that's just a total of just over 2,000 megawatts by 2035. So I know you've probably heard this before, but this amount of load growth really is unprecedented. Like a helpful analogy would be to compare this to, if we were to compare this to urban planning, essentially the anticipated rate of growth is comparable to building pretty much a whole new city over the course of a few years. And that is driven mainly by the intensification of greenhouse acreage, along with expansion of greenhouses in the Leamington, Kingsville, and Dresden areas. So then just taking a look briefly at the high growth forecast that anticipates the load forecast provided by the LDCs and the customers, but anticipates that it's addressed at a faster rate. So assuming a more aggressive infrastructure build out with basically transmission and distribution build outs occurring in parallel, plus an additional 6% growth rate on top of what we know to be interested in connecting. So that 6% is based off of input of historical acreage expansion, which was provided by OTBG. Whereas on the low end of the spectrum, the low growth forecast only considers the load that has requested a system impact assessment from the ISO or is already connected. So whether that be through a distribution connection via Hydro One or directly connected customers. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, our studies have identified concerns on the east of Chatham system starting in 2023 when the South Meadow Road load ramps up. So in the near term, this will present challenges to our ability to operate the system, resulting in congestion, resources, and a less efficient system. So while there are operating actions that can be taken to address these concerns, it does mean that load connections may be subject to a lower level of reliability until a permanent connection east of Chatham is in place. Further to that point, by 2028, under the reference load forecast, the proposed operating actions will no longer be sufficient to address these violations, and at that point, it becomes more of a reliability issue and a true capacity need arises. So while we are presenting 3 different load forecasts, the bulk of our studies to date have focused on addressing the reference load needs, which is what drives that 2028 need date. So this is sort of where the West of London bulk plan comes in. This has been broken down into 2 parts due to the magnitude of the needs that we're seeing, just so that we are able to address these concerns in a more efficient and timely manner. So in the past, this area was subject to congestion, but with the change in load patterns, the nature of the flows on those lines will change, but we will likely still see similar congestion levels. So stage 1 will focus on ensuring that there is sufficient transfer capability on the east of Chatham system in order to supply that forecasted load, while at the same time alleviating some of that congestion issue identified in order to enable existing resources in the area to operate at historic levels and supply the growing load. After that, in stage 2, we will turn our attention to a wider scope of conditions. So here is where we'd look at the full set of forecast scenarios, not just the reference forecast, deliverability of resources to help meet the provincial needs in addition to local supply, and as well as maintaining the Ontario-Michigan interchange capability and addressing any remaining operational concerns. So today we are presenting a list of shortlisted options, which we will continue to study subject to the feedback that we received today before making any recommendations. As I mentioned, the focus of stage 1 will be getting power into the Windsor-Essex Chatham area. So the key options here are reinforcing the path south from Lambton, where there is a large generation pocket, to Chatham so that it can reach this growing load pocket, or a local generation option of a 600 megawatt local generation option to help offset that capacity need that we're seeing. Whereas the focus of stage 2 is essentially reinforcing that path back towards London so as to enable the resources to supply the rest of Ontario, as well as support imports and exports. So the options that we're looking at here are reinforcing the path from Lambton to London, or from Chatham back to London, or similarly, new resources in the west of Chatham area. So given that one of the considerations, one of the options that we're looking at is for a transmission reinforcement, the earliest in-service date for this will likely be 2028, which lines up pretty well with our capacity need date as well. But that being said, that is part of the impetus for us to finalize the stage 1 recommendation by the end of the year, if possible. So then the outcome of stage 1 can then be used to finalize the connection assessment for those South Middle Road loads, So as a result, we are looking for feedback from you by December 17th, which will be used to inform our stage 1 recommendation, and formal responses to the written feedback will be provided January 11th. Beyond that, the final complete set of recommendations is anticipated for Q1 2021 with the anticipated publication of the West of London Bulk Report. And that will coincide with the targeted completion of the Windsor Essex Addendum as well, in around the same time. And then subsequent to that, Hydro One will shortly be kicking off the regional planning for the Chatham, Kent, Lambton, Sarnia area as well. So depending on the findings and recommendations from both the bulk and regional side, and if the rate of growth is any indication, likely planning in this area will continue beyond what we have outlined here as well. But this is just to give you a sense of the initiatives that we have going on right now. So with that, I think I can pass it back to Rizal. I want to see if there's any questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Candida. So again, we invite participants today to offer any questions or comments in the chat. Also, feel free to raise your hand if you'd prefer to ask it over the line. I do think, though, for those who had raised their hand in the previous Part 1 discussion, your hand is still raised, so perhaps if you wanted to, again, ask a question over the line, if you could just unraise your hand and re-raise it so we know that you have some new comments here. But there is a question. I think this is a carryover from the Part 1, but it does appear to be applicable to both studies that we're discussing today. The question's from Brandon Huzevska. The question is, as an 8 megawatt behind the meter genset producer, would the IESO see value in real-time demand production data to evaluate regional capacity or DR needs?
I mean, we always welcome data, and I know a big part of the work we did as part of the Windsor Essex LAC was working with stakeholders in the community to get some more boots on the ground data, in that case mostly related to the lighting load profiles. But yeah, the more data the better. So if you want to share that, perhaps we can touch base and chat a bit more about that.
Okay, great. So I just want to check here. Chris Codd, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question for this part of the presentation, or was that a carryover from the first part? Okay, might have been carryover. Thanks very much. Okay, so there is a comment here from Tomo Matisik at Integris. Similar comment to what was said earlier for the 650 megawatt of generation. Are you only looking at gas-fired?
Hi, Tomo. So yeah, very similar to Megan's comment earlier. We are using a gas-fired generation facility as sort of like a benchmark to determine whether or not a generation option would be more cost-effective in this for this solution. And something that we are doing that's a little less or a little beyond what we typically do for a resource option is we're also taking a look at a storage option in this area as well to just similarly determine if it meets the cost threshold as a benchmark to see if that would be a viable option here. But as Megan mentioned, it's not necessarily that's not to say that we'd go out and search specifically for a gas-fired solution or a storage solution. If we were to go down that path, it would be more of a technology agnostic type of procurement.
And a few follow-up questions to that, Candida from Tomo, whether that will be done by RFQ to evaluate alternatives.
So at this point, I see Chris Taylor's question as well, which is a bit related, but this time we can't really speak to any details around like what that a procurement would look like. As some of you are aware, there's an active engagement going on related to the resource adequacy framework, and so I think there's still a number of things on our end that we're seeking a bit more clarity around as well. But at the end of the day, if generation is a cost-effective resource to meet the community's needs, you would anticipate some type of procurement activity would be undertaken. And if you're curious around the details of what that might look like, I would encourage you, I would direct you to the resource adequacy engagement.
Great, thanks, Megan. And Fuda offered a comment here, and I think it does appear to be around the same realm of the discussion here around procurement of such resources. And earlier at the onset of today's webinar, Candice had mentioned engagement initiative around resource adequacy framework that Megan also touched on. So more information about that is available online, and that work is ongoing. So just checking here, Peter Quirin, you have your hand up. Did you have some additional questions at this point, or was that a carryover from the first part?
No, it's a carryover, and I've already tried to turn it off, but it didn't seem to be working.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Is it off now?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay, I had it wrong. Okay, sorry.
Not a problem. Thank you. Another question from Tomo. Given the advanced timelines we are using 2028, will wire solutions be procured through RFP? So I think that's a similar question.
So I guess I'll take this one. So 2028, while it seems very far away to all of us, it's not really that far away when we think about how long it takes to construct a transmission line, which optimistically can often be 5 to 7 years, given the length of the lines that we're talking about as part of the stage 1 or even the stage 2 solution. So for an initial stage 1 reinforcement, at the very least, it's likely that procurement would not be an option for those facilities given the urgent need to get that project underway. But it's something that we'll continue to assess for new transmission facilities going forward as their suitability for procurement.
Thanks, Megan. And just to further support the discussion on this topic, we've just included a link in the chat where you can find more information about the resource adequacy engagement, just given all of the discussion about it this morning. So I see Travis Lusky has his hand up. Travis, please go ahead and unmute your line.
Great. Thank you. You may have mentioned this, but I just want to, in the stage 1, at least recommended report, you're talking about a reinforcement of Lambton-Chatham corridor along with 650, their generation and storage. Can the ISO share the assumptions and analysis that led to the 650 megawatts? In particular, what is the operating parameters that are expected by the time these solutions are put forward? So this would include the amount of installed capacity, when the installed capacity would go in place, along with how many hours run and in what seasons. I think this would be helpful in understanding and tailoring a solution to what's needed, and along with a cost comparison between why the Lambton to Chatham corridor was selected for reinforcement compared to additional generation or storage, given the resource adequacy needs in the province around that time. And call it a double dip advantage for the ISO.
So I'll probably leave it to Candida to get into the details of how we developed this 650 megawatts. But just to acknowledge the questions you raised around alignment with provincial needs, we did look at that in our cost analysis. So that was folded in essentially like the two birds, one stone of if we build new capacity here that can help us achieve our provincial needs. And that was reflective as well as there are transmission limitations as you flow back towards Toronto. So 1 megawatt in Windsor isn't necessarily equivalent to 1 megawatt on a provincial basis. Candida, if you want to elaborate a bit on the planning methodology behind the 650.
Sure. The 650 is essentially looking at your reference forecast, so your total need under the reference forecast compared to your ability to serve that load based off of the current system. So the current limitations of the system considering both east and west constraints in tandem, as well as fully utilizing your existing resources. So doing that comparison, we see that by the end of that 2035 timeframe, there is a gap of 650 megawatts of capacity of load that you cannot supply with the existing system. So that's what we're looking to resolve with either the transmission solution or a generation resource.
Okay, so it's not like an hourly or dispatch analysis at this time.
Not at this.
Okay. And this might be a comment more for Candace, linking back to the resource adequacy. There hasn't been very much discussion in those engagements of linking regional needs and provincial needs. I guess the question is, what is the best approach to raising these issues? Is it here and the resource adequacy engagement? And how might the two engagement processes start to become integrated to ensure, again, you're driving towards an optimal solution, or more importantly, I think for a generation storage or non-wires, how they can ensure they capture compensation or revenue streams for both services provided to the Ontario grid.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Travis. Certainly during last week's dedicated monthly stakeholder engagement meetings, one of the things that was included was a discussion of the linkages and how different engagement initiatives relate to each other. So, we certainly do recognize the importance of creating those linkages amongst all of these various engagement activities. So your point is definitely well taken there.
And
yep.
A little bit further, in terms of the most appropriate place, I would say, like, at this time, the resource adequacy engagement is likely the most appropriate forum. That is being led by Dave Devereaux, who works in power system planning, transmission planning, also works in power system planning. So it's all kind of under the same hat. So those conversations can then occur within power system planning if you raise those concerns in that forum. Like, we're more than happy to discuss them in these regional forums as well, but it ends up being a bit more piecemeal on a region by region basis. And by all means, continue to raise these concerns. I think they're important conversations for us to have, but the bigger picture is really coming from the resource adequacy engagement.
Okay. The last comment on this, and this is a little bit more broad. I mean, this is great information, but it is the ISO presenting their findings and a Q&A with written comments. It's very difficult for market participants to present and discuss both with the ISO but with other stakeholders other viable solutions. And in particular, not necessarily the solutions themselves, but what procurement mechanisms or process steps are required. I would recommend to the ISO in the future to look and potentially give, a lot better term, floor time to market participants to present alternatives, analysis, and solutions for the ISO to take back away. And that links back to my earlier questions and requests on data required to be, informative and helpful in the analysis. So I think in a lot of these regional planning, it's a lot of great information, but there is a lack of ability to kind of present alternative views or different options.
I think that's some valuable feedback and kind of aligns with some previous feedback you gave today around some kind of non-wires working group, so to speak, that could get into a bit more detail here and kind of mirrors some activities happening in other jurisdictions for sure.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Candida.
Thank you. So I do see Stephanie Freund from Sendera Energy has her hand up. So Stephanie, at this time, I'd ask you to unmute your line and go ahead.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Just have a question regarding the gas-fired generation that's contracted through the latest TIPSAP program. I'm familiar with 3 that are pending starting up in the next year. Are these contracts factored into your planning stages at this point, or are these additional resources that are over and above what you're looking for, or how are they factored in? Because they're, I know of a couple that are pretty well ready to go, waiting for last minute kind of Hydro One connections, and but they're pretty well ready to go. They're pretty well on standby. So
all contracted resources are included in our plans.
Okay.
And we also our planning for both these regions assumes that those contracts or an equivalent resource remain in place. Yep. And then we look at sensitivities around if different reacquisition scenarios that's necessary.
Okay, that sounds good. And my last comment, I agree with Travis as well as Peter Clearing. I think talking to the actual stakeholders for the non-wire solutions and the DER, this is a must in my opinion. I think Candida can speak to that. She visited down this region last February when they were discussing with Pat Lowe for the Grid Innovation Fund, and that time spent and with Vicky as well. I believe that was very valuable time spent, and actually resulted in one of the awards through LA Grow Acres. So there was something that benefited from that visit of actually seeing ground on and getting the feedback from the growers themselves. That's my comment.
Okay. Great feedback, and I think we agree with you 100% that those conversations are really meaningful and informative, and I think we've learned a lot through them, especially the conversations we had with the local advisory committee, which really set us out on the direction of undertaking that targeted call with the Grid Innovation Fund and the learnings that will hopefully spur. So hopefully we can continue these dialogues. I think they're key to kind of really unlocking some of these alternatives.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. So just to check here, I see Pradeep Kumar has his hand up. Did you have a question, Pradeep? You can go ahead and unmute your line. No, okay, I guess not. So I'm just taking a look here. I think we've addressed everyone's raised hands, which is great. Thank you for all of those valuable questions and feedback. I also don't see that we have any further questions in the chat, so perhaps we can move along here to the rest of the presentation. So thanks everyone for that. So before we close off, we just wanted to remind everyone of some of the many ways to stay involved and informed on not just these 2 electricity planning initiatives that we've discussed today, but other ongoing work. You can sign up to receive updates on regional electricity planning, such as what we've discussed today for the Windsor-Essex region, and as Candida touched on, what is upcoming for the Chatham-Kent-Lambton-Sarnia region on the IESO website. Several of you are already members of the Southwest Regional Electricity Network. For those that are not, we do encourage you to join the ongoing dialogue through these networks where members receive updates on electricity sector developments and events. Actually coming up is the 4th Annual ISO Regional Electricity Forum that will be taking place on January 20th. This online event invites all network members from across Ontario to gather together virtually during the morning to learn about the latest electricity initiatives, and the afternoon will actually include 5 breakout sessions to discuss electricity priorities for each region. So there will be a specific afternoon session for the Southwest. We've heard a lot of great dialogue this morning about energy planning activities that are happening in the County of Essex, which the ISO is pleased to be involved in, as well as Chatham-Kent also mentioned work is happening locally on energy planning as well. And a lot of the discussion that we've had today around non-wires alternatives and potential local solutions, the regional electricity networks, particularly the forum that's coming up, will be a very great venue for us to continue these targeted discussions. So we're really excited about that. More information about that event will be coming soon, so stay tuned. And very soon we'll also be launching a new online engagement platform to help broaden the ISO's engagement efforts. A lot of this great discussion that we're having today will continue through many different venues, including this online engagement platform. And it'll really provide an additional opportunity for network members to offer focused input, such as what we've heard today, in a quick and easy way, when, where, and how they choose, and really to have that online community. A lot of what we've seen in our discussion today, which is really great. And as always, we would love to hear from you. So do get in touch with us at any time through communityengagement@iso.ca. So before we close off, we'll just leave this here for a couple minutes. Of course, just as a reminder, we have a 3-week comment period on the content that we've covered today up until December 17th, but perhaps we'll take a quick pause for a minute here to see if there are any other questions for clarification. Okay, great. So it doesn't look like there are any other questions at this time. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join this morning's webinar and for all of the incredible discussion and feedback that we've had today. We certainly look forward to receiving your written comments by December 17th on these 2 electricity planning initiatives. And I'd like to thank my colleagues Candida, Michelle, and Megan for presenting the details of these 2 studies and also answering your questions. If anything comes up after today's webinar, please get in touch with us at engagement@iso.ca. Other than that, thanks again for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.